They say never pick a fight with someone you don't know, and certainly not someone who might just outrank you in ways you can't imagine. Karen didn't get the memo. Or maybe she did and just didn't care, because when Karen sets her sights on a perceived injustice, reason takes a back seat. In this case, the injustice was my barn. It started on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind of peaceful day that makes you want to get your hands dirty and enjoy the scent of fresh-cut lumber in the air. I had taken the week off work to finish up the siding on a barn I'd been planning and building for months. A classic red structure with white trim, it was straight out of a countryside postcard, sitting proudly on the far edge of my 5-acre lot. Everything was by the book. Permits filed. Foundation inspected. Every beam, every nail, every detail was done legally, carefully, and personally. I had just set my hammer down and was admiring how the morning sun bounced off the glossy paint when I noticed movement at the edge of my property. There she was. Karen. She lived 2 houses down, but her presence was impossible to ignore, arms crossed like she was preparing for battle, lips pursed, sunglasses perched unnecessarily on her head despite the mild weather. She looked like she was trying to stare the barn into dust. "That structure doesn't meet neighborhood standards," she called out, her voice sharp and pointed like she'd practiced it in the mirror. I turned around slowly, squinting in her direction. "Good morning to you too, Karen." She wasn't amused. She waved her phone at me. "I've already taken photos. This is going to code enforcement." I tilted my head. "I've got permits, Karen. It's a barn. It's allowed." Karen didn't even blink. "We'll see about that." Then she turned on her heel and marched back to her house like she'd just won a lawsuit. I stood there for a minute, chuckling to myself. This wasn't the first time Karen had gone on a crusade. Last summer, she called the fire department because someone had the audacity to light a bonfire in their own backyard. The year before that, she tried to ban basketball hoops from being installed on driveways. To her, rules weren't just guidelines, they were weapons. And she loved to swing them around like a sword. I wasn't worried, not really. Like I told her, everything had been done correctly, by the book. I even triple-checked setbacks, maximum height allowances, and the ridiculous color palette standards that applied to structures visible from the road. My barn passed with flying colors, literally and legally. 2 days passed, and I almost forgot about Karen's tantrum. Then, around 10 in the morning, a white Ford Explorer with a county seal pulled into my driveway. A man in khakis and a button-up shirt stepped out, clipboard in hand. Code enforcement. I walked over, wiping paint off my hands. "Morning," I said. He gave me a friendly nod. "Good morning, sir. We received an anonymous complaint about a non-compliant structure on your property." I raised one eyebrow. "Anonymous, huh?" "Yeah. Photos were submitted too." He flipped the clipboard around to show a few black and white printouts, poorly angled shots of the barn, clearly taken from Karen's upstairs window. I had to bite back a laugh. "Let me guess. Blonde, chin-length bob, perfume so strong it can clear a field?" He chuckled. "You're not the first to describe her that way." I invited him over to the barn and handed him copies of my permits, complete with zoning clearance, site plans, and inspector sign-offs. He flipped through them, nodding slowly. "Honestly, this looks perfect. You're well within your zoning rights. Setbacks are correct, it's under the maximum allowable square footage, and you've got a valid permit on file." I smiled. "That's good to hear." He paused, looking at the signature on one of the documents. Then back at me. Wait, are you Michael Lewis?" "In the flesh," I said. "The zoning commissioner?" he asked. "Guilty." His jaw went slack for a moment. "Well, damn," he muttered under his breath. "No wonder this all looks flawless." "Thanks," I said, pouring him a cup of coffee from the thermos I kept nearby. "I don't like cutting corners." He laughed and took a sip. "I'll close the case right now." "Waste of time, really. Sorry you had to deal with this." "No worries," I said, looking toward Karen's house where a curtain just fluttered shut. As the code officer left, I lingered outside. It wasn't just about the barn anymore. Karen had made it personal. And though I wasn't a vindictive man, I did find it amusing that she thought she could out-regulate the very person who writes the regulations. What did she think I did all day? Knit sweaters? I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat easily. But something about that moment. The startled look on the officer's face, the familiar sound of Karen's blinds snapping closed, and the way my barn stood gleaming in the sunlight, told me this story was just beginning. And I had a front row seat. By the time the code officer drove away and I watched Karen's curtains shift for the 5th time that morning, I knew this wasn't over. Karen didn't retreat after a loss. She regrouped. She plotted. She treated zoning laws like they were her own personal battlefield, and I had just dared to win the first round. A week passed. Things were calm. Too calm. I kept working on the interior of the barn, insulating the walls and installing vintage barn lights I'd picked up at an auction. Every so often I'd glance across the property line and spot her watching from behind her garden trellis or peeking from the upstairs window like some cartoon villain. But she didn't say a word. Not yet. Then one Saturday morning, I got the first hint of her next move. I was hauling hay into the barn when I saw her knocking on my neighbor's door with a clipboard in hand and a forced smile glued to her face. She gestured toward my barn, then held out the clipboard. My neighbor, Jeff, who's lived next to me for almost 12 years, looked confused. He leaned over to peek at the paper, shook his head, and politely closed the door. Curious, I waited until Jeff came over that evening for our usual beer on the porch. "She tried to get me to sign some petition," he said, cracking open his drink. "Claimed your barn was lowering property values and was not in harmony with the neighborhood aesthetic." I nearly choked on my sip. What neighborhood aesthetic? We live in the countryside. My other neighbor keeps goats in his front yard. Exactly, Jeff chuckled. Told her she was wasting her time. Besides, it looks good. Clean, classic. She's really doing this, I muttered. And she was. Over the next week, Karen made her rounds like a door-to-door salesman, trying to stir up discontent where there was none. She even tried to bribe people, offering homemade banana bread if they signed. One woman posted on the community Facebook group that Karen promised her free lawn care for the summer if she'd join the cause. The post exploded. Within an hour, the comments were brutal. "It's literally a barn. In a rural zone. Karen, go touch grass." Asterisk. I'm more offended by her banana bread than the barn. Asterisk. Is she okay? Like, actually okay? Asterisk. But Karen wasn't done. The petition failed, the neighbors laughed her off, and the Facebook group mostly banned her for starting drama. So she upped the ante. This time, she filed a formal complaint with the zoning board, citing aesthetic disruption and inappropriate use of land under residential agricultural standards. It was a bunch of legal-sounding fluff, but it got her on the agenda for the next zoning hearing. She clearly thought she was building momentum. I was the chair of that zoning board. Naturally, I recused myself as soon as I saw the complaint. Conflict of interest, and all. But I didn't have to be there to know how this would go. The night of the hearing arrived. The small municipal meeting room was packed tighter than usual. A few curious neighbors showed up just for the entertainment, some bringing popcorn, literally. I stood at the back, out of the way, watching quietly as Karen stepped up to the podium like she was giving a TED Talk. Dressed in an over-the-top outfit, white blouse with pearl buttons, hair curled just so, and a bright red binder clutched tightly. She looked like she was about to pitch a hostile corporate takeover, not argue about a barn. She cleared her throat dramatically and began. My name is Karen Arlington, and I represent concerned citizens who believe this barn, she held up a printout of my property, is a blight on our community and was likely approved through negligence or favoritism. Gasps from a few audience members. Murmurs. The board remained professional. Karen went on, flipping through her binder to reveal color-coded tabs, annotated photos, and, no joke, Pinterest screenshots of barns she deemed more appropriate. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes, quoting obscure architectural style guides and making wild claims about property devaluation. Then came the best part. One of the board members leaned into his microphone and asked, "Ms. Arlington, are you aware that the barn was built within full compliance of our current zoning code?" "Yes, but," she began. "And that it holds a valid permit signed by the county's zoning commissioner?" She hesitated, caught off guard. "That's exactly my concern. I believe the commissioner used his position to bypass community review." Another board member frowned. "Are you accusing Commissioner Lewis of misconduct?" Karen squared her shoulders. "I'm simply raising the question." There was a long pause. Then, a third member, an older woman named Patricia who'd been on the board for nearly 20 years, spoke up. "I helped write those zoning updates with Commissioner Lewis. In fact, the barn standards were his idea. And we unanimously passed those changes 2 years ago." The look on Karen's face said everything. She hadn't just misunderstood the rules, she had gone to war with the man who literally authored them. The board called for a vote. 4 in favor of keeping the barn as is. 0 opposed. Karen didn't even wait for the meeting to end. She gathered her binder, clutched it to her chest, and bolted out of the room like a kid caught cheating on a test. The room buzzed with amusement. I stayed back, letting the crowd filter out before stepping into the hallway. A few people nodded at me, grinning. Someone slapped me on the back and said, "Hell of a barn you got there." I smiled and thanked them. But even then, I had a feeling Karen wasn't quite done yet. People like her don't give up, they escalate. But for now, as I drove home under a moonlit sky, I felt the satisfaction of someone who didn't just win a fight, but did it without ever throwing a punch. All it took was the truth, a few signatures, and a barn built by the book. A week passed after the zoning board hearing, and things finally seemed to settle down. Karen had been humiliated in a room full of people, her so-called evidence dismissed, her petition laughed off, and her carefully orchestrated crusade derailed completely. Most people, after all that, would have taken the hint, maybe issued a sheepish apology, or at least disappeared quietly into the background. Not Karen. She vanished from public view for a few days. No sightings, no odd glances from the window, no new Facebook posts filled with passive-aggressive complaints about barns and rural decay. It was eerily quiet, and that's exactly why I didn't trust it. Karen wasn't the type to wave a white flag. She was the type to reload. I found out through a colleague at the county office what her next move was. She had filed an official complaint with the county ethics committee. Yes, ethics. According to her, I had used the influence of my office for personal gain. In her version of the story, I'd twisted the zoning rules to suit my personal project, fast-tracked my own permits, and manipulated the system from within. It was laughable. The ethics committee doesn't operate like a courtroom, it's not some dramatic process with televised hearings, but it does take complaints seriously. And so I received a formal notice to appear for a review. I wasn't worried. My documentation was airtight. I had recused myself from every relevant decision. The permits were filed under a separate zoning officer who had no connection to me other than working for the same county. Everything had been by the book, because I wrote the book. Still, it wasn't about the barn anymore. Karen wanted a fight. She didn't care about rules or reality, just revenge. When I showed up to the ethics committee meeting, I came prepared. I had binders of documentation, copies of email chains, building permits, correspondence with the county inspectors, and even timestamps showing when each step had been completed. It was boring stuff to anyone else, but to a bureaucrat like me, it was beautiful. Karen was already there, sitting in the waiting area with a smug smile and another one of her red binders. She didn't say a word to me, but her expression said everything. She thought she'd finally cornered me. This was her moment. Her victory lap. The ethics committee was her final stand, the place where she'd watch me be dragged down and disgraced. What she didn't know was that the committee chairperson, an older man named Harold, had been my mentor when I first started in the department. He was fair, methodical, and allergic to nonsense. And boy, was he about to get a full dose of it. Karen opened the meeting with a dramatic reading of her complaint. She cited obscure lines from the zoning manual, misquoted county procedures, and even tried to present a local poll she had conducted, on her Facebook page. She talked for nearly 20 minutes straight without a single interruption, her voice trembling with self-righteous fury. When she was done, Harold cleared his throat and turned to me. "Mr. Lewis, your response." I kept it simple. I walked them through the process, step by step, showing the timeline, the approvals, the recusal forms, and the signatures. I explained how every element of the barn had gone through proper review, none of which involved me directly. I even brought in statements from the zoning staff who handled my application. By the time I was done, Harold leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Ms. Arlington," he said, folding his hands. "I see no ethical violation here. In fact, I see a clear overabundance of transparency." Karen's mouth opened. She looked like she wanted to speak but couldn't find words. "Unless you have new, relevant information," Harold continued, "this matter is resolved. Case dismissed." Karen stood up abruptly, knocking her binder off the table with a loud slap. She picked it up, mumbled something under her breath, and stormed out of the room. I stayed seated for a moment, letting the absurdity of the situation settle in. It was over. Really over. No more complaints, no more hearings, no more dramatic accusations from across the property line. Or so I thought. 2 days later, I noticed a large "for sale" sign staked into Karen's front lawn. At first, I didn't believe it. But it was real, complete with the name of a local realtor and a flyer box that was half empty by the end of the day. The news traveled fast. Neighbors started texting me, asking if I'd heard. Apparently, Karen had told people she was no longer comfortable living in a community where personal vendettas and corruption go unchecked. Which, translated from Karen speak, meant, I lost, and now I'm leaving. I didn't gloat. Not out loud. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel an incredible sense of satisfaction when I saw the moving truck arrive. It was a warm Saturday morning, and I was out by the barn again, hanging the last piece of hardware on the loft doors. I had just installed a shiny new weather vane. A sleek, metal rooster with a very subtle middle finger silhouette worked into the tail feathers. It was childish, I know. But incredibly satisfying. As the movers loaded box after box into the truck, Karen stood on her porch, arms crossed, surveying her kingdom one last time. When her eyes landed on me, I gave her a polite wave. She didn't return it. She walked over, heels clicking on the driveway, and stopped just short of the property line. "You think you won, don't you?" she said, her voice bitter. I didn't answer right away. Just looked at her, calm and steady. "Karen, I didn't want to win anything. I just wanted to build a barn." She shook her head, scoffing. "Whatever. Enjoy your little kingdom." Then she turned and walked away. I watched her climb into the SUV and drive off behind the moving truck, her house growing smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared completely. The neighborhood felt instantly lighter. Now, every time I walk into that barn, I smile. It's not just a structure, it's a symbol of patience, of doing things the right way, and of refusing to be bullied by people who think rules only matter when they can use them as weapons. Karen tried to turn the system against me. She forgot that I am the system. And unlike her, I don't bend the rules, I build by them. Sometimes, justice doesn't come with sirens or judges. Sometimes it shows up quietly, wrapped in blueprints and permits, and leaves behind a barn that will stand longer than the memory of anyone who tried to tear it down. And that, to me, is better than any argument ever won.